Good morning, everybody. It's really good to have so many of you join us this morning for our webinar on the civil service job cuts. I'm Siobhan Benita. I'm a former UK civil servant, and I'm delighted to be chairing this webinar on behalf of Global Government Forum, a publishing house that serves civil servants here in the UK and all around the world. So in terms of today's topic, the government has revealed plans to cut 91,000 jobs to tackle what the Prime Minister has described as a swollen civil service. The plan for cuts is intended to return the civil service back to 2016 staff levels, following an increase in staff numbers to deal with Brexit and then the coronavirus pandemic. So in today's conversation, we'll consider how these reductions will be delivered, what the impact will be on staff, on leaders and the service, especially as the government is facing delivery pressures in a number of service areas post-COVID, when many Brexit-related functions still need to be carried out, and when the government is also keen to boost the UK's resilience to future shocks. I'm delighted that we have a really expert and experienced panel with us here today. We've got Philip Rycroft, who is former permanent secretary at the Department for Exiting the European Union. We've got Rhys Klein, who is senior researcher at the Institute for Government, and Una O'Brien, who is the former permanent secretary at the Department of Health. And in a moment, we're going to hear from each of them who are going to give us some kind of opening remarks. But before we do any of that, I'm just going to invite Richard Johnstone, who is the executive editor for Global Government Forum, to set the context for us, to explain exactly what has been announced and put it in some kind of historical context. So over to you, Richard.
Thanks, Siobhan. I just wanted to set out the details of what we know so far and how it matches up with what has been achieved in the civil service before. So the announcement of the job cuts was made in the Daily Mail newspaper 2 weeks ago today, that the government would look to cut 91,000 civil service jobs. That amounts to around 1/5 of the service, and as Siobhan said, is intended to get back to the level it was at in 2016. The plan was announced in the newspaper by the Prime Minister and the Minister for Government Efficiency, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and it probably is worth noting at this point that no subsequent official announcement has been forthcoming. But the Prime Minister said, that it was an effort to tackle the swollen civil service, while Jacob Rees-Mogg told the same paper that it was because the effects of the pandemic and the aftermath of Brexit could be unwound from the civil service. So that 2016 figure that keeps being referred to is, to put it exactly, 384,260, the number of employees in the civil service just before the EU referendum in June 2016. And since then, it has grown to its current level of around 475,020 full-time equivalent civil servants. So some rough mathematics, you can work out where that 91,000 came from. That 2016 figure in itself is a historic low in the size of the civil service, the lowest it had been since the Second World War, and was the culmination of a 4-year programme under the coalition to get staff numbers down to 380,000. So it never quite hit the target set by Francis Maude, the Cabinet Office Minister. We were 4,000 or so off, but it got pretty close. And the scale of reductions that the government is planning now is similar to that programme that was overseen by Francis Maude, as the starting point in 2010 was around 470,000 civil servants. So it's a similar sort of reduction. And that's one lesson, perhaps, for the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Office Minister, Jacob Rees-Mogg, that with concerted political focus and action, this kind of reduction can be achieved, although that 2016 low in numbers was achieved a year after it was planned to be in the Civil Service Reform Plan. So it may take longer than planned. And indeed, we don't have a target date yet for the reductions for when these 91,000 jobs are meant to have gone by. So we've been told in the details that we have in the plan that permanent secretaries have been given a month to come up with ideas on how to make these reductions. So we're 2 weeks into that period now, and have been asked to model headcount cuts that could be between 20, 30 and 40%. So again, the balance of the cuts between departments is not yet clear. Just to provide a little bit of context of where these jobs might be found, in terms of headcounts, 4 big departments stand out, employing over 50,000 staff. The Department for Work and Pensions and Ministry of Justice are the biggest, with both over 80,000 employees. HMRC has around 60,000 employees, and the Ministry of Defence is just behind that. Behind those biggest 4, the Home Office is around 40,000, and then there are a number of departments with between 20 and 30,000 staff. But interesting contrast to that, the biggest staff changes since 2016, the ones that the government seems keen to reverse, have came in other departments. Not wanting to steal Rhys's thunder, but the IFG analysis has highlighted that these big departments still employ fewer staff than they did in 2010, and the growth has been in other areas. The Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport, for example, has quadrupled in size, while the Department for Education and Cabinet Office have nearly doubled. It is worth reflecting as that Jacob Rees-Mogg is right that civil service has grown in response to those twin crises, and it possibly has grown in a less structured way than you would wish if you were sitting in the Cabinet Office. The policy profession has grown most since 2016, followed by project delivery, property and analytics, but there's been less growth in some other areas that the government deems important, like digital, data and technology and commercial skills. But the early examples that ministers have said, early examples of how these cuts might be made include a recruitment freeze, meaning that vacancies would be unfilled, and the end of the civil service fast stream. So if the growth since 2016 has been unstructured, those are the kind of blunt approaches that could well make that problem worse. There doesn't seem to be an underlying plan as of yet. And the final point, just for context, the headcount reduction comes alongside the government's levelling up agenda, which has seen it announce plans to move 22,000 civil servants out of London, and they've already made a decent start on that. There's already 4,000 or so posts that have moved. And commenting on the cuts plan, the Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Simon Clarke, said the levelling up agenda remains unchanged. So they still want to move that number of jobs out of the capital, meaning, in Simon Clarke's words, there will need to be more cuts in London. That's the reality. So that's just some facts and figures to provide context for the rest of the conversation, Siobhan.
Thank you so much, Richard. That's such a helpful kind of opening presentation there. So really stressing the scale of what's been announced, so up to 1/5 of the service to be cut, showing that it has been done in the past, but going down to that really historical low of 2016. So interesting, can we compare those two things? Is that the right comparison to be making? You mentioned there that permanent secretaries have been given a month, we think, although none of this really has been put in any kind of official plan yet, so been given a month to come up with their plans for reductions, but we really don't know how those reductions are going to be spread across the service. You mentioned there which are the biggest departments, but also highlighted the fact growth hasn't necessarily been in those biggest departments. And then also, how is this going to link with other government initiatives such as the levelling up agenda? So lots of food for thought there to start us off. I know the audience are going to be really interested and probably have lots of questions. I should have said at the beginning, before I invite our speakers now to give their thoughts, there will be lots of opportunity for you, the audience, to put your questions to the panel. So whichever device you're on, there should be a Q&A function. You should see the Q&A button somewhere. Please use that Q&A function from now on to send in your questions, and we will get through as many of those as we can today before the end of the webinar. You can send in absolutely any question that you like to put to our fantastic panel. So thanks very much, Richard. Philip, now I'm coming over to you.
Great, thanks, Siobhan. And I'll keep this brief so it allows plenty of time for questions. So my background is very briefly 30 years as civil servant, 20 of those in Scotland, working for the various emanations of the government in Scotland, and then 10 years in Whitehall. I had 3 interludes in the course of my career, a couple of years in the European Commission, and a couple of stints out in business as well. So I got a sort of a broader perspective on how big organisations operate, now do various non-exec academic type things. So, you know, my perspective on this, I've been involved in 2 quite big expansions of civil service numbers. One, when we crossed the devolution horizon in Scotland, and the number of civil servants working for the centre of government in Scotland increased commensurately. And then when I worked in the Department for Exit in the EU, I came in when the department was, I can't remember the exact number, but a couple hundred strong. By the time I left, we got up to 700. And that was a very rapid growth in response to the exigencies of the day through the Brexit process. But also one major contraction. So I was in the Cabinet Office for a good part of the Maud era, when, as we've heard from Richard, the numbers came down. And that was pressure across the board to achieve that goal. So opening reflections on all of this. I think first point is there are relatively weak market signals and disciplines on bureaucracies generally. This is true right around the world. And if unchecked, bureaucracies do have a tendency to sort of expand to fill the space around them. So it's perfectly reasonable for governments, the political side of the equation, to apply the brakes from time to time. We saw that obviously 2010 through to 2015. A lot of numbers came out, but it is worth pointing out that a lot of those numbers were in the big departments where there was a substitution of labour, if you like, for tech. And I suspect there is that a lot of that, the scope for that has now been used up. So question mark, where do you get 90,000 jobs out as we look forward? I think the thing that strikes me about the approach to this is obviously it was a very political announcement through the Daily Mail. This was part of the distraction the tactics that this government uses. Civil service is an easy target, and what they've put in place is essentially an arbitrary number. And I think the point I just finished this introductory bit on is to say this is a very odd way of doing your workforce planning, just to sort of almost pluck a number out the air and say this is what we're going for. And you'd have thought we'd have learned by now. We're all quite sophisticated people with sophisticated bureaucracies, sophisticated government, that we would have learned a better way of doing this, where you relate the size of the resource that you have to what you want to achieve. And clearly, what the government is doing now is a very, very crude mechanism indeed. And that, I think, will carry consequences which will have to be worked through over the next little while. Anyway, I'll leave it at that for the intro.
Thanks, Philip. I mean, already there's questions coming in there, in particular picking up, I think, on what you just said around this is an odd way to do workforce planning, a very crude, blunt instrument, but also interesting, like the balance there that you put, not unreasonable for governments to apply brakes on the numbers, but actually the way this has been done, questionable in terms of kind of very political announcement. And I'm sure many people in the audience will have sympathy with what you say about the civil service being an easy target at the moment. So thank you very much, Philip. And Rhys, I'm going to come over to you, and I'm sure you probably want to unpick this issue of kind of this is an odd way to do workforce planning, but over to you.
Thanks very much, Vaughan, and good morning, everyone. As Richard generously teased in his introduction, we at the Institute for Government spend an awful lot of time poring over civil service statistics because we know how to have a good time. So I thought what would be good is I'll just set out 5 kind of quick points about the size and scale of the proposed cuts and, as you say, the implications for approaches to workforce planning. The first that I think it's worth reiterating is that this will be a deeper cut than the one first proposed at the spending review last year. We first heard in October that the government was aiming for a return to pre-COVID headcount while protecting frontline roles. We calculated that that would have probably meant in the region of about 30,000 roles, depending on how the government defined frontline. The obvious difference as has been noticed now, is that we're going back to pre-Brexit headcount, and the reference to protecting frontline roles seems to have been dropped. The second point is that it's deeper, but it's also a faster cut than we are, or the government is used to. Richard's right that we haven't had any official confirmation of timeframes, but the briefing has been that it will be over the next 3 years in the SR. The cuts from 2010 to 16 entailed a 22% reduction in the size of the civil service over 6 years. This would mean a 19% reduction, so a little bit smaller but comparable, but over 3 years, so half the time. And therefore that adds to the challenge of making it a reality. The third point is that the relative size and changing shape of government will make these reductions even more difficult. Richard and Philip have both rightly mentioned the 5 biggest departments: DWP, MOJ, HMRC, MOD, and the Home Office, and the fact that they have seen the smallest proportional growth. In most of their cases, they are smaller than they were in 2010. But the other side of that problem is that the smaller departments that have seen the biggest proportional growth are comparatively very, very small. So, if we take into account the department and the agencies around them, DCMS has about 3,000 officials, Treasury about 3,000, international trade the same, education about 10,000, Cabinet Office about 16,000, right? So there's not much scope there, despite the proportional growth, to amount to the cut. That sort of leads us on to point number 4 I wanted to open with, which is, therefore, we have to be open and honest that these cuts will, to one extent or another, have to include frontline roles, and they will have to include some back office skills the government is separately trying to prioritise. So we know that about half of the civil service work in frontline jobs in DWP, in job centres, in prisons and MOJ, HMRC, MOD and the Home Office. For the sake of argument, if the government said they wanted to protect jobs in those big operational departments, to meet their 91,000 cut, they would effectively have to scrap the 10 smallest policy departments entirely, leaving only BAE standing, right? Now, of course, that's absurd. That's not going to be the approach, but it illustrates the difficulty and the trade-offs that are at stake. It's also true when we look at the back office skills. Richard rightly pointed out that the policy profession has grown the most since 2016, but it has grown at least partly for a reason. A lot of them are indispensable. They're serving permanent post-Brexit responsibilities, and also there are only 30,000 of them in that profession anyway. So even if you decided to get rid of them all, it would be, you wouldn't be anywhere close to the target. So just to end on the kind of method, I absolutely agree with Philip's point that arbitrary headcount targets are not the right starting place. They are not an efficient mechanism for workforce planning. And just to add to what Philip said, I think that they're a blunt tool, partly because they're blind to the false economies that can be created in this process. So particularly, they're blind to the sort of costly boom and bust of contraction and expansion of civil service, as we've seen throughout the civil service history. They're blind to increased use of contractors, to increase spend, for example, in major projects portfolios where there might be sort of issues created by understaffing. Ultimately, if the aim is efficiency, then we need to factor in the resource required to achieve priorities. If the aim is financial savings, budgetary targets are more direct mechanisms. To rely solely on headcounts is to sort of see one particular means as the ultimate end, I think.
Thanks so much, Rhys. Can I just check on one thing there, because you mentioned the time. We had a question in from Hannah Hook, I think already, which said, I thought the cuts have been announced to be over 3 years. I think that was in something responding to what Richard had said, but are you saying the assumption is they will be over 3 years, but it's not? Well,
when it was first introduced at the SR, it was over the SR period, so which would now be 3 years. And the briefing at the time a couple of weeks ago suggested that it would be over the same time frame. But again, we haven't seen any official confirmation of that.
Okay, thanks. So really interesting what you're saying about how this has gone further, obviously, than what was announced in the spending review now to pre-Brexit rather than pre-COVID levels. And what does that mean for protecting frontline jobs? Because we're having questions in about that already. So I think we'll come back to that as well. Thanks very much, Rhys. Again, loads and loads to unpick in the conversation that we're going to have afterwards. Una, I'm coming over to you now.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and it's very nice to be part of this discussion on what is really a very tricky conundrum that we're facing at the moment. My background is that I served in the civil service for 27 years before I stepped back from my role as Permanent Secretary at the Department of Health in 2016. And one of the things I did during that time was I spent 3 years in the Cabinet Office Efficiency Unit in the late 1990s. Just thinking about these few opening remarks, I'm going to make no apology for going back into history and to ask the question, what can we draw from previous efforts at efficiency in the modern state, if you like, that might help us as we search around for practical tools that can help when we think about how to face this. I want to say, first of all, though, that as far as my understanding of the public is concerned and the evidence from the public is that people do not want a poorly managed state. They actually want exactly the opposite. They want it to be efficient, accessible for what they need, and prompt in its response to whether it's a payment or a registration or a piece of regulation. So that's my starting point. I'm going to go pick a few examples from the past and see whether any of the tools and ideas from that can help. For nearly 20 years, there existed at the centre of the Cabinet Office an efficiency unit, also known as Rayner's Raiders, private sector leaders brought into the centre of government to organise efficiency reviews. And that was a method of 90-day scrutinies that lasted a surprisingly long time. But in the era that I worked in the efficiency unit, in its final years, I think we'd come to a realisation that small reviews of parts of government departments really wasn't cutting it for what we actually needed to change. And that more and more the reviews came to look at whole systems. So I, for example, worked on a review of the criminal justice system. And that was really the first time that these wider systemic views about the relationship between departments and local delivery started to be properly looked at in government. And so my lesson from that for the future is that the system really matters. You can't just approach a challenge like this on a departmental basis. Have to look at the wider implications, both across government, but also out into the delivery chain, whatever it might be. The second big leap that happens in the late 80s, and it's surprising how long this has really lasted, was the creation of Next Steps agencies, ably devised and led by Kate Jenkins. And one of the things that I really draw from that whole experience, quite apart from the fact that it's still a major framer of the architecture of our modern state and civil service, are the core questions that we used in those Next Steps reviews. And these questions are really, really helpful when we come to look at the future of a department or a chunk of work in central government. Is this task needed at all? Does it need to be done by the state? If it needs to be done by the state, could it be done in another way? Can it be privatised? These are sort of fundamental sequence of questions which have been refined over the years and are still available, and I hope widely used and should be used when we come to look at some of these bigger challenges. The third one I think is worth just recalling, we haven't mentioned yet, of course, is the Gershon Review, which was a major review of public sector efficiency. So the system lesson had landed by 2003. And out of that came the 2.5% efficiency challenge for the whole of the public sector in the 2004 spending review. There was a 71,000 job cut challenge for the civil service, but it was somewhat easier times because there had been quite a bit of growth in the early Blair years. So in a sense, it was sort of addressing a rapid bloatedness that needed to be brought into line. However, the key lesson from that, which I think is really helpful to have in our minds today, is that the process internally within departments, when all the reviews had been done and the targets set, the process within departments was very painful. And many people still talk about, I had to apply for my job, or I had to apply for 6 different jobs when I could just have been slotted in to, you know, the one I finally got. And this caused a great deal of challenge to morale and simple delivery problems, which were disrupted by the processes that were chosen to bring about the change. So those are 3 lessons that I would draw. The system really matters because of the point that Rhys and Philip have made about unintended consequences, or allowing costs to build up in another area if you make the change without thinking of others. Sequential questions, asking whether the work needs to be done in government at all, and if not, where could it be done? Can it be done in a different way? And thirdly, when everybody, all the headlines have gone and the hard work begins of delivering these changes, this process has implications, and having a highly capable HR support to make this happen, whatever is decided in the end, is incredibly important.
Thanks so much, Una. I mean, really interesting there to look back on the past, because I think there is a sense, I think, especially for the wider public, that this is the first time the civil service is being asked to do this. I think every administration comes in kind of with that message. And actually, the civil service over the years has had to do this kind of on many, many occasions, is constantly evolving, constantly changing. But also what you say there at the end, this is not a pain-free process. And I think there's lots of lessons to be learned about how it's been done. But I want to we've got so many questions coming in. I'm going to actually go straight to the questions from the audience now. And I want to pick up on what you said there, Una, about the lesson about system matters. And I think it reflects what other people said, is that you can't just do this central department headcount. It's not a very effective way of doing it. We've had 3 questions in, one from Simon, one from Philip, and one from Richard, about whether these cuts will affect arm's length bodies and how they're going to affect arm's length bodies. So in particular, are there kind of opportunities in the arm's length bodies to find efficiencies with automation, for example? Is that somewhere where we could be looking? And there are high numbers of staff, says Richard, in arm's length bodies such as in NHS England. So will that be in scope of these reductions? Una, you talked about the system. So to what effect do you think in this particular round of reductions arm's length bodies are going to be impacted?
Well, I think the difficulty in answering any of these questions, Siobhan, is that I wouldn't start from here. I mean, I'm completely in agreement with Philip and Rhys that starting with a crude headcount doesn't, in a way, it denies you the opportunity to look at this systematically and come up with efficiencies that enable us to do more with less, or the same with less. So if we were doing this professionally, I would say, of course, we should include the whole of the central state. So just for clarity, that everybody understands, agencies are largely, nearly all civil servants, and the agencies sit under the umbrella of a department. We also have a number of arm's length bodies and regulators where, for various reasons, the status of the people who work there is not civil service. So if I, just name some of the regulators would fulfill that. So of course that should be included if we're looking at a comprehensive way of regrouping work, or digitizing work, or commercializing work. Not to do so is to make it even cruder than it already is.
Thanks, Una. Philip, you were nodding a bit there. To what extent do you think that this is going to affect the wider system?
Well, yeah, I absolutely agree with Una on this one. You wouldn't start from here. And, you've got to think, what are you trying to achieve as a state? I don't know whether this will cheer folk up or not, but I had occasion when I was working on Brexit to point out more than once when the civil service was under huge pressure. I'm saying to ministers quietly, I'm allowed to say this, and I won't say which ministers, but come on, guys, you want to take back control. You need a civil service to do that, and there only is one. There is only one civil service, isn't another one waiting around the corner. So you've got to look after this institution. You've got to think about how it can succeed in serving you, serving the public. In an ideal world, the way you would approach, you would think about what is the service we want to deliver to older people, to youngsters, the school system, and how does this system as a whole integrate, not just what happens in Whitehall or in arm's length bodies, but also in local authorities, in the health service. Don't forget the civil service itself is only a small proportion of the totality of public sector employment. So you would actually start off from the user perspective. How does social care work in a way that delivers those services for the older folk in the most effective way that meets their needs? And you'd work up from that. I have no doubt at all that if you took that sort of approach, you could both reduce the cost to the state and improve the service to the individual. But that requires a sophisticated, mature, non-politicized, non-partisan approach to thinking about the public service. And through that, we would, and this is not impossible, by the way, it does happen in other countries. And Rhys is probably the man here for the more comparative stuff, but it can be done. So anyway, that's a long way of saying, agreeing with you, I wouldn't start from here, but the systems approach is absolutely critical. Just one final quick point on that. England in particular remains a very, very centralized system. And one way that you could reduce pressure on the centre is actually through what I would consider proper devolution. But that's another story. And despite all the levelling up rhetoric, I don't yet see that happening, but I hope at some point it will come.
Thanks, Philip. So Rhys, I mean, as Philip said there, are there any comparisons between kind of our numbers in the UK of the civil service and other countries? Can we draw those type of comparisons? And do you think this will affect the kind of that wider system, this latest round of cuts?
Just to start on that final point and to add a sort of technical point, we know separately that the Cabinet Office and Jacob Rees-Mogg are going about the Public Bodies Reform Programme. And part of that is looking at efficiency and size of those bodies. So for public bodies that are not civil service by classification, that would be outside the scope of this target, but it is happening and it is a question that's ongoing. On your point about international comparisons, that there is data out there that we're looking at increasingly, and it's essentially at the headline from comparing the UK civil service to other countries' central civil services on a per capita basis, so proportional to the population, is that we're sort of mid-table. We're sort of middle of the pack. There are countries like New Zealand and Canada, which have proportionally bigger civil services. And there are plenty of countries like Germany and Japan that are proportionally smaller. So, for example, the UK has, we did this earlier in the week, the UK has 143 citizens for every one civil service. By contrast, New Zealand has only 79 citizens for one central civil servant, but the other end of the scale, Japan, has 216. But the really interesting factor at play there that you can see when you compare, and this speaks to Philip's point, which I totally agree with, is that the extent to which those systems of government are centralized or decentralized seems to have quite a big effect. So in countries like Japan and Germany that have comparatively small federal civil services at the center of government, they have comparatively bigger regional and local government, both in terms of the functions at play there and staffing. So that is another trade-off that the government needs to bear in mind if it's seeking to reduce the size significantly of the central civil service.
Thanks, Rhys. Okay, so I'm going to move on to another question. This question has come in from Sean Clayton. I think this is going to be something that lots of members of the audience will want to know the answer to. So it's, have ministers indicated any willingness to scale back their policy asks to match resources available, or is the expectation that fewer civil servants will be expected to do either longer hours or reduce the quality of their work? Great question from Sean. And I want to link this to this kind of the narrative out there that now we're past COVID and now we're past Brexit, there's kind of less to do, because that's what they're kind of basing this, their figure on, their baseline figure on. So Philip, I'm going to start with you. Are more, is there more to do with fewer civil servants, or is there genuinely less work to be done?
Don't get me started. I'll deal with the Brexit stuff, and Una can deal with the health stuff. Taking back control meant bringing back a whole load of bureaucracy that was previously transacted quite efficiently as it happens on behalf of 28 member states in Brussels. We now have to essentially repatriate that, and we have to build duplicate systems across the piece. Self-evidently at the border, with all the customs requirements, this is a huge burden on businesses, but it is new dead weight bureaucracy. And in order to transact those systems, you need people to do it. And that was not required before, is required now. And you can see that duplicated across a whole range of functions: product safety, trade negotiations, trade remedies. Pretty much every department with an interface with the economy is going to have to grow its policy functions in order to deal with that. Moreover, ministers have this ambition to remake the British regulatory state, no longer content just to ride on the back of the inherited law from the EU. They want to remake all of that law. That requires self-evidently civil servants to do the drafting of the bills and so on, but then you need people, whether it's civil servants or regulators, to run those new systems. So the comparison with pre-2016, this is not like for like. Effectively, the government is asking the system as a whole to do more with fewer people than we had in 2016. So how that is managed, the only way that the government can do that is essentially to withdraw the state from other domains of activity. And what I've not yet seen is any indication of where that might be, because I've not yet seen ministers saying, do you know what, the state can come out of these various other functions. So this is, I think, really, really difficult territory. And I just hope that senior folk in the civil service are pointing this out to ministers.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. So, I mean, Una, that's quite a stark message for civil servants, isn't it? Do more with less. And also you touched on the issue of morale. So with that in mind, kind of how do you think civil servants are going to be feeling about this? I mean, the audience are obviously sending in lots of questions about it, but one, how is that going to be managed, that doing more with less, but also what does it mean for morale across the service?
Well, yeah, Sean, it's a really, really great question. And we know from the experience, if we look just more recently at the work of Francis Baldwin Efficiency Reform Group, which was, to be honest, extremely painful to live through. But now I look back at the relatively recent reports from the National Audit Office about, well, what was the outcome of all of that? By focusing on commercial and contracts and getting a better deal for government, offloading a lot of property that arguably wasn't needed, very significant investment in digital, and to be fair, quite a lot of investment in the skills agenda. And those are the things that you have to do to be able to do more with less. You have to invest to save. You can't just reduce, because that is effectively a cut. And it does link back to that previous question. So if this is the cut, what is it that's going to be stopped or done by in another part of the economy? Just a quick word, if I may, building on that, Siobhan, on the future. I think Philip's just spoken there very eloquently about what I would call the regulatory state. But we need to remember the public care about the delivery state. That's where the frontline jobs are. That's where the vast majority of people who work in those are not highly paid. The average salary is somewhere around about 30,000 a year. These jobs are distributed all over the country, and people in the population, our friends and families and everything, need that delivery state to function efficiently. So where there is scope for that to be digitised and to be streamlined, it is the right thing to do. But we also have to remember now there's two other really crucial elements of the state where we need capability for the future. What I would call security and resilience. The whole global order is being upended by the war in Ukraine and raises huge questions about all aspects of our security and resilience. And obviously health resilience is part of that, but also we're desperately lacking in capability at the centre to really drive some big policy initiatives on climate change. One I know about myself is that the whole challenge around heat, and that there just is not yet an answer to this, let alone the whole delivery mechanism that has to go in behind it. So that's just one of many aspects of climate change where we need to be refreshing and building our capability. So for my approach would be to look at, well, what is the capability we need going forward, as much as it is to doing what is effectively a slash and burn approach.
Thanks, Una. So I think you mentioned there was a question in from Edward, can better online services achieve headcount savings? You're saying there is some potential there for kind of services.
Yeah. But you need a different type of skill to back up those services.
Yeah, absolutely. Reece, so I want to come back to you on this question of, are we just asking civil servants to do more with less? And you mentioned the kind of 2016 baseline numbers not necessarily being the right one. And Una there has talked about climate change, resilience. Philip was talking about all of these post-Brexit functions that are now permanently here in the UK. What's the IFG thoughts then on kind of just using that figure? Is that completely the wrong figure to be aiming for?
Yeah, well, I think Una and Philip have illustrated perfectly why some of the several reasons why 2016 is quite a peculiar benchmark to take. There's also just a logical place to start, which is that these cuts are supposed to get the civil service to a shape and size that would be its sort of most effective state in 2025. So it's a strange assumption to make that the size and shape of the civil service nearly a decade earlier in 2016 is just by chance the right size and shape of the civil service a decade later, right? So I think there's a kind of logical point. And then I totally agree on the post-Brexit responsibilities and on the resilience and security points. I think there's also a long-term history point that we can make here as well. I mean, Richard referenced in his introduction that the civil service was the smallest it had been in 2016 since the Second World War. But if we look even longer, the civil service even now, but especially if these cuts were made, is quite significantly closer to the size it was at the turn of the 20th century than it was at the end of the Second World War. So these questions of what functions are we sacrificing in order to make things happen? What are we asking civil servants not to do? Is true over the past few years in the post-Brexit and post-COVID landscape, but it's also broader. You know, we're going to a real historic low. So I think that sort of hammers home Una's point that it really does need to be based on a systemic workforce planning programme that is given time to mature. I mean, the only other point I'd like to add on this area is that there are moments and ways in which we can start to see over the coming months how this might or might not be being balanced. So, for example, the spending review at the end of last year was based on assumptions of what departments would deliver. We're set to get new outcome delivery plans in the summer. That is a statement of departments and what they are going to achieve with their resource. So these are the avenues we'll have to look at in the coming weeks and months to see whether that thinking is filtering through or whether departments are being asked to do more with less.
I mean, you've mentioned there lots of times kind of the need for proper workforce planning, but I think you also said at the beginning, is it permanent secretaries have been given 1 month to come up with plans? Yeah,
well, certainly what we've seen briefed in the press is a sort of month to come back with 20, 30, 40% scenario plans. And obviously, I'd be interested to hear from Una and Philip on their experiences of that method in the past, because what we see is maybe that often that generates more fiction than non-fiction. But also what we hear sort of behind the scenes is that some departments may not have even been given that commission officially. So we don't quite know what state of play departments are at, and it certainly isn't the space and support required to come up with detailed and broad workforce plans. But you can't get there in a month, to be blunt.
Well, I'm going to pick that up then. I'm going to ask Philip and Una about how, from their perspective as former permanent secretaries, how do they think departmental leaders will be looking at these plans now? But I want to bring in, because I think it's relevant then, 2 questions we've had from Jennifer and from Ian. Jennifer is saying, what's the usual number of people leaving the civil service each year? She suspects around 30,000. So is it possible that all of these 90,000 can be achieved without compulsory redundancies? And similarly, Ian has said, can the cuts be achieved through natural wastage, or are there likely to be voluntary or even compulsory redundancies involved here? Richard, if you want to come in on this from any previous analysis, then let me know. Philip, your thoughts on how this might be achieved?
This is really, really tough. I mean, it's tough on the leadership of departments, but it's clearly tough on the staff in departments as well. And there's no sort of gilding that. It's just, this is really, really hard work. And if you think about the approach taken, it's a sort of zero-sum game. If it was a permanent secretary, so I'm going to offer up my 40%, and whoever's running this exercise, well, thank you very much, we'll have that. You're not sort of going to get any credit for that. So, what is there is very limited incentive to engage with this exercise in a way that puts your head above the parapet. I could describe it like that. So how how people will go for it is they will, all of these descriptions of various scenarios will get more and more lurid as to what damage it will do to the government's objectives. Of course, people are going to approach it like that because they know that if they take in these cuts, it's going to be extraordinarily painful. It also, in a way, sort of punishes those who've run pretty tight departments for the last 4 or 5 years or whatever. So like, I'm not carrying any, I'm not carrying excess baggage because I've run a good department. Now you want me to take it. So you get the point. So this is very, very tough. And of course, at some point the money is going to be allocated, and there won't be, and that will mean that departments are going to have to reduce headcount. You can go some way, of course, with natural wastage. That's a horrible expression, but you can go with turnover and folk leaving. Will get you so far, but there is whether it'll get you far enough, we won't know until actually these numbers are imposed. But the second point, I think, is as if not more important, that doesn't allow you to control for the skills mix that you require in a department. We've already talked about, if you want to achieve some of these efficiencies, then you're going to have to make more use of technology or whatever, and that requires different sorts of skills to come in. If we're going to use data better in government, if we're going to be more responsive to changes in the needs of the public and so on, bringing in different sorts of folk with different skills. So actually just relying on who decides to leave when is a very ineffective way of building the right sort of team. And just one final point on all of this, that this is ultimately, you're looking for a civil service is upskilled. Let me just say, when I was working in Dexter, we were recruiting a lot of people in, a lot of young folk coming in who were just brilliant. They were coming in with very, great qualifications, quite a lot of them with great work experience. And the market out there for these sorts of individuals now is very, very hot indeed. So in order to get the talent in, the civil service is going to have to make the offer attractive. And as I say, it's very difficult again to do that if you're being squeezed and you're relying on folk leaving to achieve those, because you're not going to get the right balance of skills that you need to run an effective modern civil service.
I'm going to come back on that issue of recruitment and retention because we've had a question on that as well. But Una, just your thoughts on this kind of, will it be through natural kind of wastage, the numbers? Picking up on what Philip said, there was a comment from another Philip, Craig, who said, because Philip, I think you said departments that have done this quite well, run a tight ship, are they going to be kind of disproportionately affected kind of thing? And Philip has said, why is strategic workforce planning not business as usual across all anyway? So Una, your thoughts on all of this?
Well, I hope and I would expect that senior teams and government departments will engage with this professionally and bring forward, they should be on top of all of their numbers anyway. I know they are. They have to be, in terms of the running costs, the numbers of their staff. There's far better data inside departments around skills and capability now than maybe even 10 years ago. So with that more available, they ought to be able to put a very clear picture in front of ministers on what the choices are that they have under those different scenarios. And it is the case that there is that risk that departments that have run a very tight ship are really scratching their heads to say, well, where else can we go other than actually stopping functions altogether? I think I would counsel against, over exaggerating the impact, because that certainly doesn't help to engage ministers in a constructive dialogue. One of the interesting things looking back on the Gershon review was that built on deep dialogue with departments. And one of the reasons why it was, although the era was very different, I do accept that it made it more possible to implement the changes, was that senior teams and government departments were involved from the very, very beginning. So there's something about the way this gets done, as well as what's being done. And we should never underestimate that the process of setting the target and then delivering it is itself a potential helper or disruptor.
Thanks, Una. Richard, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, just on the redundancies point, just to provide some clarification, ministers haven't ruled that out. They're trying to, or are saying that they will aim to get the jobs down through the kind of recruitment freeze that we've discussed, but there's not been ruling out of either voluntary or compulsory redundancies at the moment. Although the Cabinet Office in a report I've seen was emphasising that it would more likely be voluntary redundancies. And interestingly, those voluntary redundancies would be on the terms that were in place in 2010, in the early years of the coalition, because there was a change to the redundancy terms that was made by the Cabinet Office, but that was subsequently found to be unlawful and hasn't been, terms haven't been changed subsequently to that. So yeah, it'll be on the very old and more generous terms than the government did try to introduce.
Great, thanks, Richard. So I do want to come back to this issue of skills and talent and retaining good people or recruiting good people. So John Cockaday has said, if pay is severely constrained while routes to promotion are cut off, so there is a sense that, there'll be a bit of a freeze of movement, won't the numbers reduction just lead to an exit of the brightest and the best? And then to add to that, Nadeem Khan has said, if this is going to be achieved largely through recruitment freezing and stopping people moving around, that might work for those in generic admin roles, but for those of us in specialised roles, we probably won't have as many equivalent other roles that we can move into. So again, I think this sense that maybe in particular people in professions, in specialist professions, some of those skilled staff that we really need coming in might leave now. And Rhys, I also want to touch on, you said, oh no, I think it was Richard who said there's a possibility that the fast stream will be stopped for a little while as well. So getting some of that talent coming in. So Rhys, I'm going to come to you. Your thoughts on what impact, I mean, this is always an issue anyway for the civil service to recruit and retain good people. Is this going to make it even harder?
Yes, I mean, certainly if the government use blunt tools like blanket recruitment freezes, that is a natural barrier for several reasons. Firstly, because on the conversation about turnover, we do know that about 6% of the civil service leave each year. That's the sort of steady-ish current state. So if they did institute a complete blanket recruitment freeze at the most extreme level, they would just about reach roughly the target in 3 years, but by surrendering any control over who remains in posts and what posts you're resourcing. To come back on your fast stream point, that is the other risk of these sort of blunt tools, is you cut off those effective routes for talent introduction into the civil service. And the fast stream is a great example of that, but so are other ones like the apprenticeship scheme, for example. Apprenticeship strategy is halfway through. It's got an ambitious target about the percentage of the civil service that should be made up by apprentices. Valuable additions to teams across the civil service. That's another area of risk. And the other, and on your point about skills, certainly the consequence of all of that is that the ambitions in the Declaration on Government Reform to improve project delivery skills, science and engineering, digital and data, commercial, they're all sort of questioned in that context. The other point I just would add on this is the other aspect to this skills and experience question is diversity and inclusion. And schemes like the fast stream and apprenticeships, those routes are also very effective ways to continue the progress of making sure the civil service is representative of society. So if you block those routes off, you also lose those mechanisms to carry on momentum on diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, thanks, Rhys. So Philip, did you want to add in, because you've stressed this need, to be looking at the skills that we need. This is obviously going to make this harder, isn't it?
Yeah, no, inevitably. And, just with my various other hats on now, that it's a very hot market out there. I mean, slightly oddly, and given where the economy is at, but what's going on in the UK labour markets, partly as a consequence of Brexit and other things, talented, experienced folk are in great demand. We are in an inflationary era, which the younger of the audience, I can remember when inflation was happening last at this sort of level, but this is we haven't had this for like 2-3 decades. So and in an inflationary era, that public sector pay inevitably tends to lag private sector pay, because the public systems are slower to respond, and government has a responsibility to try and dampen an inflationary expectations. So all of this will make it harder for the civil service to attract the sort of folk we want. I think it is just worth a couple of other quick points on this. I think one, people's expectations coming into the civil service these days are rather different than when I joined. Certainly the folk that I work with in DEXU, saying they were coming in, we'll do 3 or 4 years and maybe move on, and maybe come back again. A very different attitude to their professional development, their career development. That's not just true of civil service, that's true, I think, across many private sector organisations as well. And the civil service, I think, needs to adapt to that. And that means being an attractive employer in terms of the atmosphere in which people are working, the flexibility you get at work, as well as the reward package. And all of this sort of publicity, frankly, militates against that. It's not good for the image or the reputation of the civil service. Having said all of that, let me just sort of slight corrective to my gloom through all of this. I think my worry is that this is a very politicized move. And you may wonder, therefore, whether the political energy will be there to see it through. But the way it was announced, context in which it's been announced, I think this is using the civil service as a whipping boy, which I think is just disgraceful personally. But the civil service is an incredibly resilient organisation. It is also still top of the pops in terms of choice of career for folk coming out of university. So there is still a lot of people want to come into the civil service, and the civil service has weathered these sorts of storms before. I just, my heart sort of sinks, because all my former colleagues, I just don't want to have to go through all of this to come out the other end, to keep sustaining their professionalism, continuing to deliver for the public, when ministers are being, I think, irresponsible in the way that they treat the civil service. But it's just worth saying the civil service is an incredibly resilient, tough organisation, and will pull through this and ultimately get back to what it does best, which is, as I say, deliver for the public.
Yeah, thanks for it. And interesting what you said there about the kind of the current context, because I think somebody in the questions has said, do we really think that these reductions will be actually delivered, because maybe with all the tension and the kind of pushback, there will be a rethink on some of this. So that's interesting. But Una, your thoughts on kind of the impact of all of this on recruiting, kind of skilled people that we need, but also, as Rhys brought in, the wider inclusion agenda as well, diversity and inclusion.
There's no doubt the single biggest risk is the loss of talented, capable people who have highly marketable skills, and the difficulty in then replacing those skills. And this is why it's to go about anything like this, whatever scale is eventually decided on, you have to begin with, as a leader, a group of leaders working out, well, what are the jobs we're going to need to do in the future, and what type of skills do we need? And then, crucially, to make sure that you have systems internally to reach out to the people that you want to keep. One of the big conundrums with these programs, and the private sector goes through this as well, and has abandoned trying to do things in a simple job cuts way, because they find that the people who leave before you've even got round to talking to them are the people who've got really great skills, you know, go off and, you know, especially in the professions, it's very, very easy these days to get a job as a lawyer, an accountant, a cyber security specialist, a digital specialist. There are plenty of opportunities out there. So we ought to be really having a skills retention policy that relates directly to the people that are really crucial for us to keep. On the fast stream, look, it shouldn't be sacrosanct. Every part needs to be looked at, and you know, it probably does need a refresh in some way to see if it is really meeting that crucially important goal of bringing people from more diverse backgrounds in every possible respect. But make no mistake about it, you know, all big organisations need a graduate recruitment scheme, and if we walk away from that, I think other major employers like management consultancies and so on will just be rubbing their hands to think they don't have to compete with the civil service anymore. So it would be a very curious own goal, and I don't think it's sacrosanct in terms of reform, but certainly we want to have a second thought before we really implemented that.
Thanks, Una. Just to add, Reese, I'm going to come back to you on this because we've had a follow-up question from Nazu Ali, who has said that the government have recently published their diversity and inclusion strategy for 2022 to 2025, and BAME staff are extremely worried and concerned that these cuts will impact disproportionately on them, on these groups of staff. How can this be avoided, and how can we prevent litigation claims when staff are treated unfairly? I just wonder, was there any analysis done in the past of how different groups maybe were affected by these different efficiency programs?
It's a really interesting question. I suppose it depends on which parts of departments and levels of seniority are the focus of cuts moving forward, right? So one thing we know, looking at the diversity of the civil service, is that quite a lot of progress has been made in recent years on representation, but the biggest gaps that remain on representation remain at the most senior levels, right? So if the cuts fall disproportionately at more junior grades where there's bigger numbers, obviously that will have an effect on how the balance of cuts falls in terms of diversity, but also it will have unseen longer term consequences for diversity and inclusion, because if you block off those channels that we've just been talking about in terms of apprenticeships in the fast stream, that has knock-on effects at more senior levels with more time from which you progress beyond the cuts. So there's the immediate effect you can see, and then there's the sort of unseen longer term effect, I think. Yeah,
thanks, Reese. We've still got lots and lots of questions coming in. I like this one. This is slightly different. This is from Samuel O. Samuel has said, what value do the panel see, if any, in creating a mechanism for generating ideas from staff for efficiency savings within the area and more broadly in the department, rather than in a classic top-down approach? I think this maybe is something that has been tried before. I seem to remember something like this. Una, you're nodding. Do you think this is a good idea?
Absolutely, and it's a great question, and this is the spirit really in which, you know, if we can build this challenge into something that engages staff. In my experience, some of the best answers about what needs to change, and I'm talking generally now in public services and the NHS, as well as the civil service, come from the teams of people who already do the work. They often see some of the inefficiencies they're dealing with on a daily basis, and they've got great ideas. So, you know, I'd love to see an initiative like that. I know there was something like this in 2011, 2012, and Francis Maud was very, very keen on hearing what ideas came forward from staff, and a number of them were implemented. So, yeah, I think that would be an excellent thing if somehow that can be shoehorned into the approach we've been discussing.
Yeah. Reese, did you want to come in? I saw you nodding on that. Was this something that...
Yeah, I mean, well, firstly, just to agree, and my background before the IFG was in local government, and have sort of lived through the you know, seen the effect of some of those long-term cuts there, and often councils that sort of dealt better on a morale perspective, ones that were able to build in engagement processes that are meaningful and effective. But I was nodding also because it's another reason why there's an important decision to be made now, which is to sort of give senior officials and departments the time to plan the cuts properly, because what you can't do in a month to come back with plans of 20, 30, and 40% is meaningful workforce engagement on it. So if that's the planned approach, then it also has implications for how much time departments are given now to put them in place.
Yeah, thanks, Rhys. I see the time is running out, so I'm going to move on to another question. Philip, I'm going to put this one to you, and it's from John again. John has said, hasn't the government, in brackets, maybe Jacob Rees-Mogg, also said that recruitment to the senior civil service should be opened up to more people from outside? But surely talented people, I mean, it's a bit what we said before, won't really want to come into the civil service if they know that the organisation is contracting. So there's that. And also, wouldn't that just drive up salaries? And I want to add in as well, another thing that Jacob Rees-Mogg has said is that more civil servants should go back to the office. Isn't that also going to drive up costs? So I just want your thought on how you manage these potentially inconsistent messages coming out.
Yeah, no, it's again a good question. I having been sort of a senior civil servant, left the civil service, to do comments and actually left altogether, but did come back again. I think that sort of interchange is great. I think I came back, I hope, as a better civil servant from my experience in business. And bringing people in on a more permanent basis with a wider mix of experience is important. I think a couple of points on that. Let's not forget that even in policy, it is a profession. You learn stuff through a career which is often taken for granted, and those skills, that knowledge, that understanding is not instantly replicable for somebody coming in from outside. So this sort of thing needs to be managed quite carefully. But it done judiciously, I think it is an enriching experience for the civil service and for the individuals involved. There are, I'm afraid to say this, but you reach a point where there are rather large pay differentials. So that does restrict the pool of folk who you can bring in, particularly mid-career, at a senior level, simply because the private sector at those levels pays a lot more. I mean, that's just what the numbers show you. So you have to work through all of that. But what won't happen is, as a result of that, is the government, I'm afraid, is not going to turn around short term and say, oh, we've got to increase pay for civil servants. That's just not going to happen in the current circumstances. So that tension is always there. I mean, just one very quick final point from me on all of this. If you think about public service and what the civil service is there to do, I think that point earlier on about taking ideas from the from bottom up rather than top down, I think it encapsulates something that is really, really important in all of this. Thinking about public service should actually start off with those who are delivering the service to the public, teachers, nurses, doctors, social workers, and so on. And we should build systems on that knowledge upwards. And what we do through these sorts of exercises, starting at the peak of all of this as civil service, doing it all downwards is the wrong way around, in my view. I find that incredibly frustrating. I found it frustrating as a civil servant. I now found it frustrating as a citizen. We'll get there one day. But I think for those who are listening to this, stick with it, because you do an immensely valuable job for the country, and through common sense, ultimately, one hopes will prevail. But good luck with it all.
Thank you, Phil. I'm sure the audience will really appreciate hearing that. We do have time just for one final. I'm going to combine two questions and give you each a chance to answer this. And Una, just to say as well that lots of people liked what you said about learning from the past and have said, can we feed that back to people who are leading work on this current round? So I will make sure that we see if we can make that happen. But I like these two very, very quickly. I'm going to put it to all of you. And Richard, you can in particular come in on one if you like. But Rachel has asked, are there any departments ring-fenced from workforce reductions? I'm going to tweak that question slightly and say, do you think there should be any departments ring-fenced from workforce reductions? And then Graham Pendlebury has said, in my long civil service experience, the two areas that never saw headcount reduction were the number of ministers in each department and the number of staff in their private offices? Can we ever envisage ministers taking their own medicine? So they're the last two questions I'm going to put to you. Feel free to answer one or both of those questions. Richard, I'm just going to start to you, maybe your thoughts on kind of the department. You might not want to comment on ministers.
Yeah, I don't think, as it stands, we've got any indication of any departments that are not being asked to at least go through this process. And, you know, as they go through it, you know, for Philip's comments that hopefully common sense will prevail, hopefully some common sense will be applied to the workforce planning so that these aren't all relatively arbitrary reductions having to be done across the board to every department. But as things stand, there's no great political statement like there was, for example, under the coalition government, that the NHS wouldn't receive a cash budget cut, or that defence spending would be protected. We haven't got that yet. And just on the ministerial point, I mean, it seems like a million years ago now, but we had a very rare and principled resignation of a minister by Lord Agnew from the Treasury a couple of months ago over the kind of fraud prevention around the COVID schemes, and he seemed to have come to the end of his tether somewhat, and it was an unusual action of a minister kind of saying that I can't continue with this anymore. Of course, I think he has been replaced in that role, so it didn't lead to a reduction
No
in
natural
staff
wastage
numbers.
there.
Yes, exactly.
Rhys, your thoughts on both those things?
On the ring fencing, you're right. I don't think there's been any indication of that. However, I just point out three individual departments that I think whose position are noteworthy and that we should consider in this conversation. First is BLUC, which was one of the big losers in the 2010-16 reductions, and also now has been one of the ones whose remit has expanded so widely in the context of levelling up. That's interesting. Work and pensions as well continues to fall, is smaller than it was in 2010. Given the economic crisis we're in, I think that's noteworthy. Important frontline system that was able to absorb some shock in the COVID pandemic and increase the demand for UC. I think that's interesting. And the last one on that is FCDO, the only department to reduce in size over the COVID period after the merger. So again, that's starting from a very different place to the other departments. On the second question on ministers and SPADs, I mean, I won't comment too heavily on that, except to give two classic IFG stats, which is that we have more ministers than most international countries, and we have an all-time high of SPADs from the UK at the moment.
Thanks, Rhys. Philip, did you want to add anything on this?
As Rhys talked, so you could go through every department and you could make a case for why every department is facing particular burdens at the moment. So that actually pushes you in a position you want to ring fence all of them, which rather defeats the objects of the exercise. But you can't. I don't think you can exempt anybody, because I don't. I think I could make a good case for every department facing particular pressures. Hi, Graham. That's a great question. And I agree with you. I think there's this sort of cognitive dissonance that, the ministers, particularly those who have a bit of an animus towards the civil service, sort of like their civil servants, but don't like the generality. And it's that sort of, and that's partly because civil servants do such a brilliant job at being their private secretaries and running their offices. So maybe the place to start is to, reduce the number of ministers by 25%. And reduce every private office by, let's take an arbitrary number, as that's the game we're in, by 40%, and get ministers to do a little bit more of the work that the civil service does on their behalf and see how they like it. I think it's a cracking idea.
Thanks, Philip. Una, I'm going to come to you for final thoughts.
Thanks, Siobhan. Well, I just think, having heard everything today, I might summarize by just saying what I think the key risks are and my sort of short recipe. For me, the key risks of the approach, such as we know at the moment, I think there's still a lot more to come on how it could work, but there is a major risk of unintended consequences in creating cost elsewhere in the system, short-term saving leading to long-term loss of capability, and losing good people quite rapidly. So my short recipe for going forward are what I call 3 C's and an S. Clear leadership across the board. I suppose that must include ministers and senior civil servants working together on this. Careful management of the process. Compassionate with reference to the impact on the public, and then thoughtful sequencing. So a clear leadership, careful management, compassionate process, and sequencing with great intelligence. If we could have some of that, we would have some hope it could have a positive effect.
Thank you so much, Una. Well, I can't believe we've come to the end. That discussion went so quickly. We've still got some questions from the audience. We will try and pass those on behind the scenes if we didn't manage to get them answered now, and see if we can get all of those answered for you behind the scenes. We did leave with a little bit of hope there then in terms of how this might be able to be managed carefully, but no doubt this is a difficult time. I think we've all recognised a really difficult time for civil servants. I want to add my own thanks to all the civil servants working hard out there, and everything you've done throughout the last few years kept us going through the pandemic. Hugely grateful, and you definitely don't get the recognition that you all should get as often enough as you should do. So thank you from me. But that just leaves me to say thank you very much to our panel, to Rhys, to Philip, to Richard, and to Una. As you will see there, we've got other webinars coming up. I think there'll be a questionnaire in your inbox if you were in the audience today. Please do take a few minutes to fill that in, because it just means we can keep giving you the kind of webinars that are most useful to you. As you can see, there's one up there on early intervention, how the public sector can work together to unlock prevention. All the details are there if you want to register. You will also be sent a link to the video of this webinar. So if you weren't able to watch it all today, or if you want to watch it all again, or if you want to share it with your friends and colleagues, you will be free to do that. And there will be an article with the key issues from today's conversation that will come around in a week or so, which we will send to you as well. But thank you to all of you. Keep doing the good work. And thank you to our brilliant panel again. And I hope we see you all again very soon. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye, and enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks a lot.